Welcome back, folks. I now have the joy of speaking with my friend Michael Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. Mike, what can we talk about today?
Eric, it's always a pleasure. I wanted to talk about one of the things that I feature or talk about a lot in my book, Why America Matters, which is the rise of the surveillance state, and why every American and frankly every citizen who loves freedom around the world should be concerned. Benjamin Franklin has this great quote that goes something like this: those who would give up essential liberty for a temporary security deserve neither freedom, neither liberty, deserve neither liberty nor security. We're in an age and a time where we are slowly, day by day, giving up massive amounts of our freedoms, of our liberties. And we're doing this for this perceived sense of increased safety. A lot of this started following 9/11 with the Patriot Act and the surveillance state that was greatly enhanced in its power and came about during the course of that time. And we allowed it to happen to us, not realizing that little by little, we were being drained of something of our essential liberty, our ability to live as free citizens. And it's getting worse. We've talked on together in the past about CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, this idea that the governments around the world, including in the US, are working on a currency, on a digital coin analogous to Bitcoin, with fundamental differences, mainly being that it's the government that centrally controls the issuance and can monitor all transactions that occur using a CBDC. So it allows this massive amount of surveillance, but it also allows a massive amount of control, because if they can see what you're doing, they can also stop you from doing what you're doing and limit a citizen's ability to make purchases, to make donations, or even worse, put you on a blacklist of things where you're viewed as a despicable in one form or another. Now, CBDCs are one thing, but it's moving actually very, very quickly beyond that. So in Europe, we have this a digital identity wallet, which is essentially the same thing, where they're trying to use similar technology, sort of the blockchain technology and otherwise, to unify under one consolidated issuing authority identity cards for every person in Europe. Now, there are ostensible reasons why they want to do this. There is a real issue, a real problem that we all have today, which is how do we know, especially online, that you are human? How do we know that not only you're not a bot or some sort of sophisticated AI program, but even if we can establish that you're human, how do we know that you're a unique and specific human, a particular person? So these are the problems that we're trying that these initiatives are trying to solve. There's this, you've heard of OpenAI and its founder, Sam Altman, also working on another project called WorldCoin. And the idea is to use biometric identity, the scans of the irises of the eye, to create these unique mathematical hashes, cryptographic hashes, like you see with Bitcoin and otherwise, so that in theory, every person in the world would have a unique ID that would be unique to them, that couldn't be replicated, that they would always know. And the idea, the positives here are that it gives them inclusion into the banking system. It gives them inclusion into the right to vote once and only once as a unique person. And at least in Sam Altman and WorldCoin's view, the ability to distribute universal basic income to every person around the world, because in the future there won't be jobs. AI will take all their jobs, and so they'll have to figure out a way to give these billions of people some money, and they'll need to know therefore who they are and that each person is unique.
Okay,
Now,
so this all sounds to me like right out of the book of Revelation, the end time system that you can neither buy nor sell unless you are part of the beast system. I'm astonished, to hear myself say that. But I think in the book I have coming out in April, I touch on this. We've never had the technology in the world ever to do this kind of thing, and it's scary to me. You're spelling it out. You're saying that it's happening. Before we get into deeper stuff, what can people do to not participate in this? What can we do to make sure that this does not happen?
right. So let me say one thing. One of the problems with this, and I'm going to read a quote from my book, if that's okay. So I say that if a technology exists, then governments will exploit it. Moral implications are considered only rarely. So if a government can better track its citizens and use technology to keep them under control, they will, unless otherwise prevented. If China and other illiberal countries surveil not just their own citizens at home, but abroad, including in America, why should the United States not fail to do the same? Question mark. Doesn't this put the US at a strategic disadvantage? This is the dilemma of our age. I wrote that in Why America Matters to just point out the fundamental conflict here, that nations are in conflict. We are in conflict with other nations, including China, including Russia, including Iran in particular. These nations are taking actions, including on the surveillance and identity front. So the first thing to answer your question is, what can we do, is to be aware that Pandora is out of the box, that the technology exists. It's being implemented right now. We just talked about the European digital identity card. We talked about WorldCoin, all these other things that are happening, CBDCs. These are happening. So there are a few things that can be done. Governments will have to be involved in regulating this. So governments will push. If the surveillance state is allowed to have the upper hand, they will not take the concerns of liberty into account, and they will only take security as the ostensible reason, but the underlying reason will be their own power. So it will require citizens and their elected representatives to take more power than they have today away from the surveillance state, to limit the ability that these technologies, which exist today, can be used or misused. That is easier said than done, but we see even today, and one of the things that leaves me somewhat encouraged is this rising awareness among citizens here in the US, in Europe, in Latin America, of these dangers, and an increased motivation to do something about it. It is not inevitable that this system happens, or that it happens now, as opposed to some point in the future. Can't promise forever, but in our generation, things can be done to limit the misuse and abuse of these technologies.
Well, the question really for me is, well, there's several questions, but I'll say what I said a moment ago. It smells like something out of an end time scenario from the book of Revelation. I never thought I'd hear myself saying that, but we've never had the technology to have this kind of global control over citizens, of where you buy and sell, and to manipulate people this way. You don't normally comment on that kind of thing, but it's astonishing that this is happening in our time, and that we have to be aware of this.
I think it's no coincidence. I believe that this is true, that what was written in the book of Revelation was portending what we're living through in our generation. We see this on multiple fronts. One is the sort of identity front that we're talking about, the ability of the state, the power to control people through this form of identity, whether that comes in AI, some sort of bio identity chips, otherwise, all these things that people have talked about over the years. And it feels like science fiction, or it feels like some sort of apocalyptic horror. But it exists, and it is true. And we're seeing it, of course, and you and I have talked about this recently, in the rising conflict between nation states that we're seeing, centered around Israel, which also have this sort of book of Revelation apocalyptic overtone, for reasons we've talked about in previous episodes, around the radicalized Islamicist view, especially among the radical Shia community, that this is part of what must happen to usher in the Mahdi and the rise of the Antichrist, etc., for Islamic domination. People don't like to talk about that, but these are the issues that we are facing in our generation. And of course, the secularists, the secular media and governments and otherwise, can't even conceptualize these things, and so completely discount them, which of course renders them actually ineffective to be able to think about a response. Because if you don't realize that an issue you're facing is a spiritual issue and not a technological issue, you're completely helpless to actually address the underlying challenge.
Well, so I know you talk about this in your book, Why America Matters, which I recommend, folks. There's so much in there. But would you advise people ultimately to go to gold, to go to cash, to go to what would you say, for somebody who's listening right now? We've just got 20 seconds in this segment, but I want to follow up on that. But just give us a brief answer and then we can keep talking about
Well,
it.
the first thing I would say is that we should do everything we can to avoid falling into the trap of this digital identity system, whether through CBDCs or otherwise, or the digital identity card we're talking about in Europe. It's extremely dangerous. For example, either of these things will give governments the power to shut you off from your bank accounts in an instant, disconnect you from stores of value that you've put in the banking system, number one, limit your ability to travel, to
Forgive me.
participate.
Go into a hard break here. We'll be right
Yep.
back talking to Mike Wilkerson. The book is Why America Matters. You can find him at stormwall.com. Okay. Welcome back, talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. His book is Why America Matters. Great book. Mike, you were just making a point, and we had to go to a break. Keep going.
So, Eric, what I was saying, you asked me a question about what should people do, practically, and you mentioned in terms of storing value for investments and other things. And I wanted to just focus on, at least initially, the importance of avoiding, to the extent possible, participation in some of these systems, digital identity systems that are government controlled. Now, of course, we already live in that world today, but an identity feature like a CBDC or something that gives a government linkage and control over every activity that you do has immediate consequences. One, it has therefore the ability to disconnect and turn an individual off from the banking system. It has the ability to restrict travel, to restrict activities. All of these are stated goals and objectives of the globalist system and the aspirations that the surveillance state puts in place. Now, where can people protect themselves in terms of storing value? Certainly, finding alternatives outside of the banking system is important. One of the things that's been happening is that over the last couple of years in the US and elsewhere, the regulatory bodies, the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Treasury and other parts of the government have been working overtime to close the on and off ramps from, for example, cryptocurrencies. So people who believe, as I do, in crypto values of decentralization and stateless and bankless ways for individuals to store wealth privately and to transact privately, governments are ensuring that no longer is possible. How? By closing on and off ramps to banks. So banks are being penalized by the Treasury, by OFAC, by other parts of the government, so that they can't support the crypto industry and therefore can't support individuals' freedom or rights to do it. Gold, you mentioned as a question, we are being lied to by the government, about governments around the world, about the true state of the gold market, just as we've talked about in the past, that we're not getting good information on where inflation really is. We're also seeing massive manipulation in the gold market to try to keep the price stable, because as inflation rises around the world, all else equal, gold should be rising at a much faster rate than it has been. But because governments around the world and banks around the world are so linked to the value of gold in their assets and liabilities, they want to keep the price from moving around too much. So you see a massive manipulation in these markets. Coming back to the question that you're asking, what did I say? What could we do? Avoid, to the extent possible, participation in these systems. It's not always possible. We're subject to biometric identity and analysis when we walk down the streets, but avoid voluntary participation. Find alternatives. Utilize cash when you can. Find ways to stay out of the trap of falling deeper and deeper into the surveillance state's power.
I was going to say the other day, I mean, because this is coming home to each of us everywhere we go. I was with my old parents in Connecticut, and we thought, you know what? We're Germans. We'd like to have maybe a beer with our dinner. So I went to the local Stop and Shop, and I was told I needed to provide my driver's license, that they would scan it. This was store policy at Stop and Shop. Doesn't matter how old you are. They're obviously not carding me. They're not worried that I'm like too young to buy a beer, but to buy a 6-pack of beer, that they're actually, with a gun with a scanning gun, scanning my driver's license. And I thought to myself, this makes me not want to buy beer here because I'm like offended at this intrusion that they're taking my driver's license and that they're scanning my driver's license. And I thought to myself, this is crazy. I don't know who makes these policies, but this idea that everywhere you go, more and more and more, you're being sucked into this stuff.
Listening to you speak just reminds me of how shocking it is. First of all, how ludicrous it is. One, but two, the world that we're discussing and I'm describing, it already exists. This isn't coming. It is here. And we're facing it in all sorts of ways. And eventually the noose, which is already wrapped around our necks, starts to tighten. And it tightens as soon as we start to do things that are disagreeable to the state. Now, we're not here to talk about January 6th. We're not here to talk about everything that happened around that event, but just think for a moment about what has happened to people who even flew to DC to go to a funeral, to attend a conference on the other side of the district. They're on the same terrorist watch list. They're on the same restricted. They're on the same surveillance issues. Their banks were contacted and the government provided them information about their banks. Canadian truckers in Canada. I mean, this world is here, and we must rise up and resist it, and we need to get elected officials in place who are actually going to start rolling some of these things back. It is terrible what has happened in the last few years. The only good news is that we're finally seeing it. It's coming to light. This isn't new. It's been happening a long time.
Well, when we come back, I want to talk to you about if you see hope. I would like to think that there are people around the world, not just in the United States, who are waking up to this, that they're voters waking up to this and electing people who are awake to these things and who understand we need to go to war against this stuff. We need to fight with everything we have against this kind of mass surveillance state. It's ugly. It's consolidation of power. It's antithetical to liberty on every level. We'll be right back talking to Mike Wilkerson. Find him at stormwall.com. His book is Why America Matters. Welcome back. Talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. His book is Why America Matters. So, Mike, keep going.
Well, before the break, Eric, you asked me a question that I thought a lot about, which is there a reason to have hope? Should we believe? Should we have optimism? Should we have hope for the future in light of everything that's going on? And when you asked it just now, something occurred to me that I have two answers. For people who are willing to start resisting, people who are willing to display courage, people who are willing to stand up and take risks and start in small ways, local ways, you should have enormous hope. Because what is surprising, if I can use one word, the globalists or the surveillance state or these powers, they are shocked and surprised when moms and dads and parents actually start to push back and to say no. We've seen that, and that's been the hope and the good news in the last couple of years. You should not have hope if you're going to continue to sit on your couch in cowardice and in fear and just let these things happen and assume, well, there's nothing that can be done about it anyhow. You will be first in line here in the disaster that is to come. It takes courage and it takes a nation of people to rise up and to start exercising their God-given rights and rights given under the Constitution to resist tyranny, as we used to call it. And for those, I think there's an enormous amount of hope because we are seeing that these efforts matter and that things are changing. Eric, look at what's happening around the world in political races. So we have some terrible situations going on here in the U.S., rising out of election fraud, rising out of other things. But if we put aside the situation in America for a second, if we look at what's happening in Europe, if we look at what's happening in Latin America, last week we saw a concurrence of a number of events quite loudly in Argentina. The libertarian candidate Javier Milei won by a vast margin the presidential election by 56% on an anti-statist, anti-inflationary, anti-corruption platform, because the Peronists for decades now have decimated that economy, completely robbed the wealth of the nation, and destroyed what was one of the greatest countries in the world and one of the greatest cities in the world, Argentina, that at one point in time had a GDP that was equivalent to first world countries, and they're now completely decimated. In Europe, we're seeing country by country the rise of what the media is labeling as far right, extremist, populist, nationalist.
Yeah, whenever you believe in common sense, or when you kind of think maybe George Washington was a good guy or Abraham Lincoln was a good guy, you're now far right. So take it as a compliment, or if anybody's described that way, just think of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and I'm not kidding. But so we just saw in Europe, in the Netherlands and other places, talk about that.
When you hear the word populist, just think, people who vote the will of the people. They care about what their people think. When you hear nationalists, just say, oh yeah, a patriot, someone who loves their country. Yeah. That's what those words really mean. They get twisted to mean all sorts of things. You're a racist, you're this and that. But what we've seen, and we can go through the list, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, in Spain, the rise of these so-called rightist parties that are standing up for the will of the people, the desire of the people in their own country. Well, what are the concerns of those people in the European countries? Sovereignty, the fact that every country around Europe has given up their sovereignty to bureaucrats in Brussels, fallen for the climate change hoax that tells them they have to impoverish themselves, live in freezing cold apartments, eat bugs, not drive their own car, et cetera, et cetera. So sovereignty, identity, the cultural identity of the nation, immigration. Europe has been subject to 3 decades of mass illegal immigration. This is not just generic immigration. This is a largely Muslim population from the Maghreb of Northern Africa. And we're seeing now, in the wake of Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel, the rallying cry of Islamicists around the world. And so we're seeing these same radical Islamicists rise up, a lot of young men in these countries around Europe, and commit acts of violence and terror. And Europeans are fed up with it. So they're pushing back on sovereignty. They're pushing back on immigration. They're pushing back on Islam as it's being radicalized in their countries. And they're saying, hey, identity is the last point. Let France remain France. Let Spain remain Spain. Let Sweden remain Sweden. And this is rubbing the cat the wrong way, and the cat being the globalists who are running the bureaucracy out of Brussels over these countries. And they're actually quite afraid of these movements because they are populist, because they are representing the will of the people. And there's one clue that we need to understand how this all fits together. Those elitists are technocratic elitists who do not believe in the will of people. They despise the working class and the middle class of their own nations. They have no sense of the values that created the Christian nations in Europe or the United States, and they will never understand one another. So what I take hope in, going back to your original question, is that the men and women of Europe are waking up, and Latin America are waking up to these same issues, realizing that they can push back, that they can say no, that the power of Brussels and the EU has to be constrained. And of course, we have our specific issues here in the US as well, but it is encouraging to me to see that this is not a localized movement. This is something where the entire world, the free world, I should say at least, is waking up to these terrible crimes and atrocities that have been committed by this so-called elitist class.
We saw it in Italy. I don't know if it was a year ago, but the Italian prime minister is of this ilk. It is fascinating to me that things are so bad in these places that people are waking up and they still have the ability to do something about it. I just wonder what's going to happen in this country in the coming year. We've just got 30 seconds left. What is your guess on what's going to happen in this year?
Well, one of the things I talked about 2 years ago in the book Why America Matters, when I first wrote it, and many of the things I said are now coming to pass. One of them was that we are in this age of discovery. What did I mean by that? Was that we were coming up on a giant wave of revelation and uncovering of some of the evil and the wickedness that was going on, the corruption, the bribery, all of the things that are happening. It's coming so fast now. It's like a tidal wave. We can't even keep up. I could spend all day long on Twitter or on any of these other media platforms looking at new information that's coming up about what really happened on January 6th, the tapes, what really happened with the Hunter Biden laptop and all the files and all the corruption around it. This stuff is coming at us like a fire hose. That is from God. It's important, and that we deal with it. So 24 is going to be about the culmination of that revelation.
Thank you, Mike Wilkerson. Folks, you can follow Mike Wilkerson at stormwall.com. The book is Why America Matters.